Final Fantasy XIV, the vertical progression MMO that kinda also wants to be a horizontal progression MMO. But what does that even mean? And what does it mean for the game? Let's start with the meaning of vertical and horizontal progression MMOs. A vertical progression MMO is effectively an MMO where you always progress by the classic number go up approach. The new boss gives better gear than the last, so you need better gear to defeat it, and then a new boss comes with even better gear and the cycle continues. It is somewhat comparable to what is known as power creep in competitive games. A new character comes out, happens to be stronger than the rest, so the old ones either get forgotten or need to be updated to match. New card set released, all the cards are superior to the previous generation. That kind of stuff. More modern vertical progression MMOs tend to assist the player in understanding which item is superior with concepts such as item level, as a shorthand so the player won't need to compare all of the stats. A very classic example of a vertical progression MMO would be World of Warcraft. A short statement that somewhat matches the concept of vertical progression MMOs is out with the old, in with the new. In contrast, horizontal progression MMOs are mostly entirely opposite to the vertical ones. While sure, you may need to level up to an initially defined max level, but once you're there, well, you're there. Equipment is, for the most part, different levels of quality, but if you manage to obtain the best quality equipment, one could say you have permanently solved a problem. This is not always the case, of course, as in horizontal progression, equipment can be more specialized. This bow is for fighting mages, this bow is for fighting fighters, this bow is for a bit of everything, this bow is particularly good against this specific type of enemy, and so on. This gives reason to collect more things even after you have what might be considered optimal equipment, quote unquote. As a result of this design, horizontal MMOs have a tendency to feel the slightest bit of power creep much more severely, as a single item being even remotely superior to the competition can completely upset the balance of the game. Two solid examples of horizontal progression MMOs include old school RuneScape and Guild Wars 2. To give a bit of insight into this permanent value of equipment in these games, the Twisted Bow was added to old school RuneScape in 2017 and is still the most expensive bow in the game, and is still considered one of the best, if not the best, bow, situationally, since it counters magic. Legendary weapons were included at Guild Wars 2's launch in 2012 and have the same amount of stats as the otherwise best equipment in the game, with the unique property that legendary weapons can change their secondary stats at will to any existing stat combination, assuming you're not in combat, making them always supremely superior because you can just make them whatever you need them to be. Over time, legendary equipment for every slot has been made available, which indeed offers this same property. A short statement that somewhat matches the concept of horizontal progression MMOs is perhaps, old or new, it is all valuable. So how does all that relate to Final Fantasy XIV, and in what way is it trying to be both? Well, it mainly, but not exclusively, has to do with the way the game tries to preserve content. This is also where the two styles of MMO clash especially hard. A pretty obvious property of an ever-expanding MMO world is that there will be more and more things to maintain. Part of the reason why MMOs tend to fall into either vertical progression or horizontal progression is partly because it simply isn't realistic to do both, as these styles approach dealing with this ever-expanding world in two opposing ways. Vertical progression MMOs tend to deal with the ever-expanding world by leaving the old stuff behind. As long as the, for instance, leveling appropriate dungeons work and are mildly interesting, quote, if we make sure each player only has to do it once or twice on their journey, they probably won't mind that it is kinda jank." Unquote. Once they hit the current endgame zones, they will exclusively be seeing the newest, most polished content, and it is all relevant and kept nice and fresh. Old raids and dungeons are left behind, and as long as they don't break the game, it doesn't matter if they don't really work as well as they used to, whether because of power creep, mechanical changes, or whatever. Meanwhile, horizontal MMOs maintain most or all of the old content, as even when they add new stuff, this old stuff is still entirely relevant. However, the maintenance itself of this old content may require a lot less effort for a horizontal MMO, because new additions aren't meant to upset the power balance. It isn't meant to make the old content obsolete in the first place. So the only maintenance necessary, probably, for the old content is to make sure new additions and game changes don't break the old stuff, and if some power creep is introduced, it tends to be in small amounts, which either allows the player base to mostly ignore it. Sure, this decade-old fight used to be a bit harder, but that's okay, we all have these new fights to enjoy too. Or if not, smaller number adjustments might just fix it. Effectively, what puts these two MMO styles at odds and nigh impossible to marry is that vertical MMOs rely on being able to toss aside the old stuff to be capable of phasing forward. Horizontal MMOs instead might add new stuff less frequently, but relies on all of the content it ever introduced to stay at least somewhat relevant, to maintain stuff for the players to do. One style throws away the old content, the other preserves it. I think I've hammered that point home enough times now, right? For the most part, it should be pretty obvious that Final Fantasy XIV falls in the vertical progression MMO category, as it simply cannot be horizontal progression when it every few years adds 10 more levels to gain, partly tossing aside all the old to introduce the new, and every 8 months or so introduce a whole new gearing bracket that, again, makes all the previously optimal equipment obsolete. So, how is it 14 tries to also be horizontal? Well, it becomes a lot more obvious if we compare it to another vertical MMO, such as World of Warcraft. And just to be clear, when I list all of these examples, I'm not trying to be like, look at how much better WoW does the thing. Rather, the point is to demonstrate how Final Fantasy XIV seems to have trouble with, quote-unquote, following the plan, as it were. Leveling content. In retail World of Warcraft, Dead Mines is a low-level dungeon, perhaps comparable to Sastasha, partly because its story is also intertwined with the nearby low-level zone. Not that many would care about that these days. However, once you have surpassed the level range that Dead Mines covers, you might never have reason to set foot in this dungeon ever again, until you level a new character. Except the dungeon is entirely optional, so you might not set foot in there even then. The only other time the dungeon might come up at all is if a time walking event happens to include it. Time walking is a type of regularly recurring event where some old content can be done in a synced fashion. However, the scaling of this type of syncing is often crazy and clearly not something that is meant to be balanced. It is meant to be more of a spectacle and a funny side thing. As a result, it doesn't really matter if Dead Mines becomes terribly easy due to power creep. It doesn't really affect anyone much. Compare that to Final Fantasy XIV, where a daily roulette involves possibly any leveling dungeon the game has ever gotten. On top of that, unless you pay for a story skip, and probably a level skip, every character's journey requires you to set foot inside Sastasha and complete it. Because this content is effectively somewhat front and center for every player and can feature in any player's daily activities, it kinda needs to work and can't be too broken by imbalance. Whether it already has been broken is a separate conversation, but I hear you. Leveling at large. Final Fantasy XIV's mandatory main scenario quest, the MSQ, unless you pay to skip it, is, if you take your time, read the dialogue, watch the cutscenes, a journey that will take you over 300 hours of constant gaming to complete. You might be able to cut it in half or even slash it down to like a third by skipping all the dialogue and the cutscenes that you can skip. But that is still weeks of gaming to reach the new stuff. Is that a problem? Not necessarily. In World of Warcraft, largely thanks to their story squishing and level squishing efforts, it is possible to reach the current endgame, if you know somewhat where you're going and what you're doing, over the weekend. The key difference here is that one might say that one MMO is hurtling you towards the new stuff. They recognize you kinda need that opening journey to learn the ropes, but they really don't want you to hang around in these dusty old places for long, in case it bores you. Because they certainly aren't coming back to change it, if it does. The other MMO has you work your way through the majority of everything they ever made for the game before you are allowed to enjoy the new stuff. Job and specialization progression. Originally, World of Warcraft's talent trees gave you 1 point to specialize every level, starting at level 10. This often meant that this milestone, quote-unquote, of hitting level 10 gave you like 1% more crit chance or something. You would often need to continue investing onwards to level 20 or even 40 before an actually interesting ability was unlocked. Granted, in those times you got either new spells or new ranks of spells, making you more powerful every other level, so there were other things to look forward to. With each expansion then, a new, even fancier final talent was added, meaning that now you had to sit and drool over that until level 50 or even 60. Then Cataclysm came and introduced the concept that you had to choose a specialization instead of just putting your talent points wherever you wanted. However, this choice of a specialization also came with the additional detail that most class specializations got one of their signature abilities at level 10, and often would learn more signature abilities within the first few levels, making this level 10 milestone far more explosive. This is somewhat similar to how jobs in Final Fantasy XIV get a starting job action when they unlock the job associated with their class. Although, let's be honest here, most of these initial job actions aren't that interesting. Now, this signature ability stuff would be more comparable to if Warrior started with Raw Intuition or Fell Cleave, Paladin started with something like Holy Spirit, White Mage started with Afflatus Solace and quickly got the other Lily spells, or, for example, Bard getting one of their wait, they actually do that one. Weird. A way this refers back to the leveling content point is that part of the reason why WoW can do this and 14 apparently can't is because WoW doesn't really mind that these previously high-level abilities now can be used in low-level content, introducing cataclysmic levels of power creep. It is old content and will help the players reach the new stuff faster, and it is funny to use these crazy actions at low level. Win-win for everyone, right? 14, on the other hand, wants to try and somewhat preserve the power dynamic in these lower levels that have always been there, which makes it difficult to add new stuff to low levels. This is further compounded by how often Final Fantasy XIV has removed old actions, which has diminished what you get in low levels, especially hard. Originally, Paladins got most of their white magic from Conjurer cross-class actions. You largely wouldn't use them, but you had the option. This also better explains why the job doesn't really get any real magic until Heavensward. But in Dawntrail, Paladin just doesn't get any magic until Heavensward. Gear. World of Warcraft has frequently, over its lifespan, wrestled with the concept known as borrowed power. To give a clear example of this, in the Legion expansion, every specialization got a signature artifact weapon, which unlocked various additional passive and active abilities as you progressed. Subtlety rogues became fully impervious to fall damage. Blood Death Knight's Dancing Rune weapon now summoned 2 extra weapons instead of 1. Paladin's Divine Storm Circle AoE now shoots out in a line in addition to what it normally does. Crazy things like that. But the moment the Legion expansion ended, these artifact weapons lost their power, meaning every single passive and active effect in them stopped working instantly. All of these effects you've come to rely on and assume exist, gone. If you played the entire expansion, you might not fully remember what effects were yours and which ones were borrowed. But now you will just have to deal with that. This is sort of vertical progression in its purest form. Oh, that? No, that's old stuff. Play with the new stuff. And the door slams shut behind you. WoW also has had many set bonuses over the years, which similarly could have devastatingly powerful effects. But to make sure some future change to a class doesn't make an old set bonus break the game in half, old set bonuses are immediately turned off and made legacy, quote-unquote, bonuses that do nothing once the expansion is in the past. On the one hand, with the power creep introduced with each expansion, it's not like you need these old set bonuses anymore. On the other hand, if someone were to try to do this old content at level, good luck with that by the way, the set bonuses would just not be there. By comparison, while 14's gearing system often means the newest gear is the best, the insanely jank way that syncing works means that the best gear to beat a Stormblood ultimate may include a few actually Stormblood items, a Shadowbringer's relic weapon, and then the newest equipment in the game. Somehow, the way Final Fantasy XIV deals with giving us new stuff is to try and avoid giving us something that is too effective, because they don't want to take it back if possible. Shadowbringers giving us freely customizable stats on relic weapons makes them the best relics for Stormblood ultimates due to what is probably or possibly an unforeseen circumstance, but it is possible that the Endwalker relics didn't offer this same level of freedom to avoid giving us that again. And while we don't know yet, if Dawntrail does the same of offering us some freedom in stat choices, but not full freedom, that would give that same indication. Because World of Warcraft simply turns off and tosses aside any old equipment to make sure you cannot abuse it, they can fearlessly add some brokenly busted thing, full well knowing that it is gone the moment the next expansion releases, if not the next raid tier if they need it to be gone. So what exactly is the problem with Final Fantasy XIV in all this? I imagine it sounds like the devs are doing a decent job of attempting to preserve all the old content while introducing new stuff, right? Well, yes and no. Where vertical MMOs normally face forward in such a clearly projected way that players recognize that old content is old content, and if it doesn't really work as well as it used to, that's fine, it had its time. Because of the way Final Fantasy XIV places all the old content front and center, and in your way, as well as requiring you to be synced for old ultimates, note, I'm not saying they should do away with that. They project the indication that this content is, as far as the developers are concerned, still current content in a way, which means that this desire to keep all the content relevant and good gets in their way. Where a vertical MMO normally would be mostly fine with letting the old content stay old and possibly forgotten, Final Fantasy XIV tries to maintain the balance of this old content, and even goes back to adjust them a bit, one by one, as we have seen over the course of Endwalker and Dawntrail. Where a vertical MMO normally might be perfectly fine with totally overhauling the progression of their classes or jobs or what have you, in the interest of making it interesting later down the line, Final Fantasy XIV fears making too big changes because it might majorly impact the old content. See, the thing is, there isn't anything wrong with these things at face value. The problems this introduces to Final Fantasy XIV are two particular things. The first one, which you may have already realized, is that the reason Vertical Progression MMOs just dump the old content by the wayside is because to maintain the same velocity of content creation, to keep up the momentum with approximately the same workforce, they have to let the old stuff go and focus on the new stuff, or alternatively have some portion of the workforce focused on maintaining the old stuff. You see the problem there, right? Meanwhile, horizontal MMOs can dedicate more of their workforce to polish and maintain the old stuff, which could also be called current stuff, because it isn't old stuff, it is all currently important stuff. Alternatively, they can get by with a smaller workforce, as adding new stuff doesn't make the old stuff obsolete. What Final Fantasy XIV is doing is effectively scooping water into a boat on one end while scooping it out on the other. Their endgame design relies on vertical progression models and makes old content obsolete, but many of their core game design choices look like horizontal progression. Nearly all of the daily roulettes cover content from 2013 to 2025, a bit like how you could start on working on making a Guild Wars 2 legendary from 2012 today, if you wanted to. The only way for Final Fantasy XIV to maintain momentum while also preserving the old sort of becomes an arms race of an ever-increasing mess of relevant content that needs to be maintained, and the primary way this would work would be to constantly add more developers to be able to maintain this ever-increasing workload. In theory, anyway. It is perfectly possible all this can be preserved with a sufficiently large enough maintenance team, but each time something is changed that impacts the old, this maintenance team would need to review the entire, ever-increasing catalog to make sure it all works nicely. You see the problem? The second thing is actually in regards to the fear of overhauls. If you take a look at how a healer job plays at level 30 versus how it plays at level 50 versus how it plays at level 100, you can kind of see how level 50 is a more developed version of the level 30 experience, but the level 100 healer compared to the level 50 healer is almost two completely different games. However, if the level 50 healer had just half the tools the level 100 healer had, it might completely break the balance of the existing level 50 hard content. Or what? On the one hand, who cares? On the other hand, this would precisely cause power creep and damage to all this old content that is being painstakingly preserved to stay relevant through the syncing system. Again, things like the enmity system changes of Shadowbringers, as well as various smaller or bigger power creeps over the years, sort of undercut this argument. At the same time, this is exactly what I mean when I said that Final Fantasy XIV is a vertical MMO that also kinda wants to be a horizontal one. It simply doesn't have the manpower to maintain and preserve the quote-unquote glory of the old content while the train of new content chugs on and keeps changing stuff up and down. I know it is a rather strange tangent to finish on, but I don't think I've heard of a vertical progression MMO aside from 14 where a significant amount of players make a meal out of the fact that old hard content gets easier due to power creep. Of course it does. But all that said, what do you think could solve this problem, hypothetically? One extreme would be for 14 to take a hard turn and go all in on the vertical style, but that could introduce its own list of problems, considering how lean the current content releases are. If that's all there is, we probably need the expert roulette to be a bit more than 2 or 3 dungeons. Another option could be for 14 to try and embrace a more horizontal style. Maybe after Dawntrail, they look into some sort of progression overhaul, aiming to get you to level 100 in time for Castrum Meridianum, and then simply flatten the whole gear progression structure and then freshen up all that old content. For one, that's obviously extreme wishful thinking, and would probably take ages before everything is up to date. For two, even horizontal MMOs like Guild Wars 2 and OSRS have ways to incentivize players to do the newest content beyond achievements, and 14 would need to introduce such things themselves too. I'm just saying, I could absolutely see a world where 14 was a horizontal progression MMO instead of a vertical one. But again, what do you think? Maybe you envision something more middle of the road. I can also imagine that some go, I like the way it is going right now, that's why I'm playing the game. And that's also perfectly valid. It just looks to me like the slowest plane crash in existence sometimes. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Stormblood removed accuracy as a stat, reworked parry to tenacity, and made piety a healer-exclusive stat, while also removing cross-class actions as a feature, although the feature wasn't built upon in Heavensward anyway. Shadowbringers overhauled the enmity system, making it very simple, and Endwalker solidly defined the 2-minute burst meta. Relative to these rather game-defining overhauls, Dawntrail mainly reworked or changed some jobs.